Okay, actually, the other day on Monday, Phil and I were on KPBS talking about this issue, and before we were introduced, they said, "Well, we'll call you Professor because then people will respect what you have to say." But I'm going to call everyone by first names because I don't buy into hierarchies. So if you have any specific questions for Cease or Phil, why you let us know who they are, but please ask questions.
Just a very high level question. Is this more of a discussion on the timing of when it becomes public as opposed to should it prove public or not? That's one way if I were literature. Now I'm not so sure if that's what this discussion is.
Which way were you leaning?
I was leaning toward there's an agreement that it should eventually be available to the public, but the timing of it was what the discussion was. Now I'm not so sure.
Okay, so I'll reiterate the question. The question is it an issue of the data ever becoming public, or for sure it will become public, but it's an issue of timing when it becomes public? That's a good question.
I think that the timing is a very important issue, and let me give you an example of actually how it works in the real world. When I showed you that slide from the protein data bank with those protein molecules, what happens there is scientists from all over the world deposit their data into this data resource. And approximately what happens is as follows, and this relates to the timing. 50% of the scientists release the data immediately. About 30% actually release it at the time that the paper associated with that data is published. So that, and then the other 20% are allowed to hold it for up to 1 year, with the idea that they get the major benefit that they can out of that data, and then it becomes part of the public domain. And that's an agreement that's gone on for 20 or 30 years.
I just want to add that some of the NIH grants require that you publish the data associated with your study, so that when you publish the paper, the data goes out with it, or at the end of the study, the data gets published on NIH website. Then NIH is the National Institutes of Health. It's a federal government agency that funds much of the biomedical research.
Just to clarify, some kinds of data has to be published right away. Other kinds of data has a 6-month moratorium before it has to be released. So it really depends a lot.
Just another point on timing as it relates to scientific publication in general. The NIH and several other funding agencies, including the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in this country, the Wellcome Trust in the UK and so forth, have actually made a mandate that says if you actually take our money and do research, then you have to release the publications as fully access to the public within a year of publication. And there's been significant lobbying and pushback on this. It was passed, it was passed by government. I'm using the wrong terminologies here, but there's been significant pushback to get that bill reversed, and that yet has not happened. But that's the situation that exists.
Yes.
Is national security trumped everything?
So the question is, does national security trump everything with respect to release of data?
I guess I haven't worked on those kind of data ever, so my experience has been more with personal health information and such. So, I mean, that does trump most other issues.
Let's say that health relates to national security.
Just to give you, a couple of years ago, I gave a talk at Los Alamos National Lab, which is where a lot of the atomic bomb work was done, as you may know. And it was the only time I've actually been to an institution where they actually took my laptop away. It was gone for like an hour and a half. And I had a lot of fingerprints on it when I came back. So I don't know what they actually did to it, but they were very careful about what I was taking in and certainly what I was taking out. So I think obviously we hear cases in the news about, things that happen, but in essence, I think there's a lot of effort at keeping that kind of information secure. And
It,
my personal viewpoint, of course, is if it's in the nation's best interest, then that's what we should do.
If I could add to that, there are two kinds of data that affects national security. Some types of data related to spying or what have you is clearly stuff that you can't release. We don't have a choice of releasing that data. You did it, you go to jail. But there's a fine line that's very tricky. So some of this is called for a dual use issue, where if you use the data one way, it could make people healthier, and if you use it another way, they could use it for very bad purposes. And that's a very, very tricky area that there's a national council that's focused on how you respond to release of that kind of data. And they've been quibbling about this ever since 9/11, and they continue to try to decide where that line is.
It strikes me that the scientific literature they all bring it all that everybody owns the copyright. They need to register the copyright under different split. So it wouldn't matter if the data comes out with
So you two very good questions. So the first question, the first or the second one. The first one was about the fact that anyone can walk into a biomedical library and read the scientific literature. Well, part of the problem with that is that probably my estimate it was in the next 5 years there will be none or virtually no printed scientific journals anymore. The cost of producing them is just becoming inhibitive. And in fact, this is, of course, part of what's driven the open access movement is that non-traditional publishers could start up because the cost of actually doing this is much reduced because a lot of cost went into the printed version. Of course, there are computer terminals in the library and people can go in and do that. So, but it adds quite a barrier to actually have to drive to the library and go in there and hope no one asks you what you're doing there, versus just sitting down in your slippers and pajamas at your terminal and looking at whatever you want. So that's the first thing. The second thing you asked about is the copyright on data. What is the situation there? But it's true, and again, we'll just take the public university as an example. That essentially what we do is owned by, in my case, or our case, by now you're here, the regents of the University of California, and they own the copyright to the data that we produce. Now, whether that copyright ever gets enforced, is another question, because a lot of that data, even though it might be copyrighted, it's like it's a very murky area, because if you put it on a website, people use it, and then there's a question that maybe they are allowed to use it even with a copyright, and maybe they're not. It's a question of fair use. And there are a lot of you need copyright and patent lawyers in this whole mix to understand that, which is an example of what I mean by it being very complicated. But in general terms, I think that the university owns the copyright.
There are issues of things going the other way. Let's say somebody uses publicly available data on the internet, something dies. They try to sue you because, hey, I used your data and you wrong.
Well, in the case, maybe you want to come?
No, go ahead.
Certainly, like this kind of protein data that we were talking about, that there is always that fear that maybe someone made a mistake in that structure, that someone actually designs a drug against it, that some way ultimately that has a detrimental effect. That has never happened in the 30 years of this particular data set, and I think it seems to be intuitively, at least, lawyers I'm sure would view it very differently, that if you're doing your best effort to put the best data out there, that in principle at least you shouldn't be sued if something goes wrong. But it comes back to this issue of sometimes there is bad data, and it's very hard to distinguish the difference. And it's quite possible that in some circumstances bad data gets used. In the case that I described with the protein data bank, just to sort of describe that process a little, when those people all over the world freely give their data to that resource, there is a group of people who comb it very carefully, trying to ascertain that that data is as correct and accurate as possible. It's a whole area called what we call biocuration. So they are, and you're paying for that, okay? And then that data goes out there. Does that mean that mistakes aren't made? No, mistakes are made, but we do our best.
Yes. So I want to reiterate this question, but I think it needs an explanation for people who aren't scientists. The question really is, are we talking about the kind of data that's in a publication? Are we talking about all of the data that a scientist might accumulate during the course of their research? So the important thing to realize is that when we talk about a publication, as a rule, all of the data, the actual measurements, the photographs, the sequences, all of those things basically get compiled into results. So in a typical paper, you don't have every number that you made measurements on while you were doing lab work. You show the composite of them, the interpretation of them. In theory, somebody could hide some data that's really important for making that interpretation, and no one else can evaluate whether it's right or not if they don't have the actual numbers to look at. A wonderful example of this very recently is the data associated with vaccines and autism, a paper that was just retracted because people went back and actually looked at the data. So the issue that we are talking about right now actually deals with both things. It deals with the release of the results, but the release of all of that numerical data that goes to coming up with those results.
Well, it depends, of course, on the type of information. I wanted to make one other point that hasn't been raised, that when you actually publish a paper that's based on all of this data, there is the need, and the journals demand this, of reproducibility. So that might require that other elements that are not specifically part of the paper be accessible, and those are often made available by the publisher themselves. An example, and this is not widely done, but it's becoming more widely done. And an example of that would be software. So if you ran a piece of software to generate some data, then in principle that software also has to be available so someone can reproduce that experiment. In principle, it doesn't. Where you've got, if you have, more physical type of media, then it becomes, obviously a much more difficult problem. But there are particular projects where there are banks of information, like it could be cell cultures or whatever it might be, that essentially are available if needed. But that's again not is not very common. So in essence, a lot of that is just not available. In terms of the electronic, my dream is that one day, essentially all of the electronic components of the studies, from the lab notebooks all the way through a protocol that went to actually get to these final great Nobel Prizes, should actually in some form be available. It's a dream.
Well, so the first thing, of course, is when you're releasing clinical trials information, there is individual identities, and so you want to certainly not make all the data public. You want to obscure the identifying information. Also had some examples earlier where even that is not sufficient sometimes. So we have to be very careful in releasing this raw data. There are requirements by journals, by the funding agencies of even publishing the raw data. So those do get published. I think there are a number of resources when you go to the PubMed website where you can go to other data banks. Including the protein bank is one example, but there are plenty of other examples where you can access raw data even on the PubMed website.
So the question is, who owns the medical records associated with public health studies, and is there a requirement for some delay of release of that information?
That's pretty can lead to a very long, drawn-out answer, and I'm not sure if there's legal nuances involved. But I think, in terms of ownership of your medical record, which is generated when you go for care to your physician, you do have rights to access that information. So the physician or the hospital has control over the data. You have all rights to access that data. So you can go to the medical records office and say, I want a copy of my records. They'll charge you a nominal fee, release that information to you. In terms of being able to use that for research, there is no, if those records are used in research, I don't think there's any specified time limit on when that data can be released, but there are certainly limits on what information gets included and how that information can be made private. There are federal laws and regulations, something called HIPAA, which prohibits release of certain identifying information. So your question is verification of the lab data, for example, can be difficult because the information has been de-identified. Could you please elaborate on that? So you as a person who participated in that study unless you can get access to the raw data, that's correct. And there's another problem which comes up in some of these studies where you're required. So you mentioned cohort studies and observational studies, where even research regulations require we de-identify the information before using it in research. And there are ethical issues which come up there. So I was doing this study on follow-up for cancer screening tests, and I wanted to just look at the data to see what the rates of follow-up were. I didn't need the individual's identities, got the data. The body which reviews these research protocols is called institutional review boards, and they came back to me with a question saying, all right, if you find that some patient hasn't had a follow-up, how are you going to let their physician know? This person, the test was positive, so let's say this woman had a positive mammogram and is at risk for breast cancer. She needs to know, her physician needs to know. How do I get that? On the other hand, I asked for private information so that I wouldn't impede on the patient's privacy. So we've tried to balance those two.
I always thought the science
So the question is, is it an issue when you release data of someone else taking that data and revising it in some other way and using your data to come up with a different conclusion?
Your results,
Or check your results?
you can fudge most tests in a million ways, and it's certainly worth taking the raw data and seeing if those results are as reported. I mean, there's, all right.
Right. So if we can just take the example that Phil mentioned earlier about climate change, that's an issue where the availability of the data so that anyone could take it and process it and look at it carefully would then put scientists in a situation where they can be arguing about real numbers instead of arguing about wording in emails, right? So that's a case where access of the data would really have an influence on the public as a whole in terms of making an important decision.
I mean, I think it's true to say that the majority of scientists, if you actually read one of their studies and then even if not all of the data is available in a public archive somewhere, that in virtually all cases that person would actually forward you that data so that you could reproduce the study. I mean, I think that, the whole ethics of the community and how scientists perceive each other sort of drives that forward, and I think that works pretty well.
I just want to disagree for 1 minute. Those of you who read the New York Times, you have to go back a few years. I think that this is now about 5 years ago, an article in the New York Times written by a cancer researcher who does bioinformatics studies, computational studies on the data related to clinical research on cancer treatments. And this person wanted access to raw data that had been accumulated in some different cancer trials around the country. Flat out refused access to that data. Now, this is a case where his reanalysis of that data might have come to a different conclusion than the original people. But what matters to those of us who could be influenced by these diseases is not whether one researcher was right, but that the right interpretation gets out there ultimately. So although there is this ideal that we'll have data released, and although there are laws that say you need to release data, there are also very strong impediments that still exist to that release. So, you've had your hand up several times.
Whenever I think of this issue, I always go back to my graduate school days when I was a lab student and did a bunch of that research and was working on my postdoctoral or my doctoral thesis. And as many likely want to allow them to go off and start their new career for their new life, they've spent their whole 4, some of us 10 years working on these research projects. Want to go off in a different direction. Then it comes down to who owns the data. I'm now getting a position at a university. I want to carry on my work, but that work is founded on research I did in the So I wondered what some of the thoughts were.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is, as a young fledgling researcher who's generated the data and then moves to a different institution and wants to essentially take it with them and continue to work it. And I think that's a very good question. I want to clarify something I said before about the freedom of this whole business, in the sense that for me personally, I'm more than happy to give data away immediately at any time, because I already have tenure. It's not such a big deal for me. But I also identify with a student who may have actually, of course, done the work and produced that data. And I would always ask them first whether they were comfortable with that idea. And usually they are, because it's sort of the nature of our lab, but it would be their decision. And in the case of actually taking data to another institution to work with it, there's, of course, the issue that one says the data is supposedly owned by the institution where it was produced, but who's tracking that? Realistic. Turn the camera off. No one's really tracking that, so it really becomes down to the individuals. And I think, again, I guess Stan will probably disagree with this too, but I would say in many cases, the PI, the professor, or the principal investigator in the lab would be okay with it. But maybe your experience was different. So, not relying on the good ethics of the good professor, yes. No, but it's really, so you're essentially countering the idea that things are going to go well between the professor and the student. And if I can encapsulate what you said, and please correct me if I don't get it quite right, but essentially what you're doing is you're bringing a third party into the discussion, namely the institution, to actually, in a sense, mediate this kind of situation. So it's preempt. I mean, for me personally, that seems like a good scheme. I mean, it did make me think about a situation where, if you imagine a graduate student in the lab who's been working on this set of data for X number of years, they are very passionate about this whole thing, and it's just natural that they assume a significant level of ownership. And again, personally, it seems to me that should be honoured. But as you say, it perhaps doesn't always happen that way. So the question was, as I'd suggested, that the quality of review was declining, and what is the significance in that, and where is it all going to go? I do believe that, and I think many of my colleagues who I talk to would tend to agree with that statement. Now, there are interesting models of publishing which are actually quite different, and I don't necessarily want to get into a lot of the detail, but let me just give you one. And there's a huge sociology associated with this in different disciplines. So in biology, there's been a certain way of doing things which is very rigorous peer review, and that seems to have worked well for that community. On the other hand, in physics, they have a thing called the archive, where essentially people write up their work, they deposit it in this thing without peer review, and the amount by which it's accessed by that community essentially defines its worth. So there isn't. So it's a sort of peer review by people voting with their feet, if you like. So different communities work in different ways, and it may be that biology will move more in this kind of direction by virtue of pressure on the system.
The other thing to think about peer reviews also. I mean, there are, I guess, tiers of peer-reviewed journals. So there are some journals which do a better job of doing peer reviews, and they are higher ranked, and the quality of publications is considered much higher. You can at least help with some of the filtering related to that.
Mike. I'm going to summarize that very briefly. The question is, what we've been focusing on is the potential damage to the individual scientist if their data was released. And if that's true, and that's the only problem, then the overwhelming benefit of society to have the data released should weigh the ethics toward the release side very heavily. So I'll just come back and add a couple of things to this. One of the things that is a real issue here that Assis mentioned briefly has to do with privacy. Privacy of medical records is one type of thing. In recent years, our ability to do things computationally has grown so great that it's now possible to even take records that people think that they've hidden individual identities and take aggregate data and pinpoint an individual based on that data. This was, to my knowledge, first published in one of these open science journals, PLOS Genetics, about 2 years ago. So release of data that may tell things about you as a person is one of the ethical issues here. There's another issue that is important for society, and it comes back to the relationship between academic research and industry research. So a lot of therapies and drugs, other things that are a benefit to society, come out of research that was first done in universities. But as a rule, that data, for a company to take it and move to the next stage, to invest all the money in that, the data has to be patentable. A company does not want to spend $1 billion making a drug that another company could turn around and do the exact same thing in short order based upon the information that's publicly released, right? So the question becomes, is by keeping it private to allow the patent for a certain period of time, is that ultimately a benefit because it leads to new therapies, right? So both the privacy issue and the patent type of issue are real conundrums that affect this issue.
I guess the short answer to that is the FDA has to review the drug trials.
Do they go back to the raw data, or do
They review the raw data as well. I think they have access to the raw data. I don't know the exact review process they follow.
I mean, one of the reasons that the FDA process takes so long is, in fact, the amount of data and the whole process that's reviewed. But that's not to say, that it's not totally clean, as you're alluding to. I mean, there are well-publicized situations where clinical trials have been done, but essentially results have been got from those trials. Those trials themselves have actually been funded by the drug companies, so it's not effectively an independent study. And these are issues, and some of that. And the fact of the matter is you as an individual who's potentially taking one of those pharmaceuticals does not necessarily have access to the data for those trials, even when that data is in the public domain. Well, not it's in the public domain, but it's been published. So there are things called the Cochrane collection, which if you walked into the UCSD library, you could look at, but you wouldn't be able to look at unless you had a license for it. So you are somewhat restricted in that way. But some of that information is there, and if you could get it, you could make that interpretation. I just want to make another point about all of this, because I think it hasn't been made, and it's important to understand that we don't necessarily want to look at the Cochrane collection and the people who make that and essentially make money off it, because however you make this information available, there must be a business model. Ultimately, to sustain the availability of information, There has to be a business model. So when I talk about open access of the literature, someone is paying for that. In fact, you are actually paying for that, because what we do is we write into grants amount of money to actually pay to publish our work. It's peer reviewed and everything in the same way, but we actually pay to publish, which is the author pays model, which is the open access model, as opposed to the traditional publishing closed model, where the subscriber pays. But in the end, someone has to pay to keep the system going.
I'd like to go back and elaborate on my earlier answer. So one of the things with pharmaceutical trials is the trials that are required to get the drug approved is generally carried out on a group of patients that's relatively healthier than the population on which it will be eventually, the drug will be used. So after the drug has been approved for use, you learn new information, and that's collected by the pharmaceutical company, and that's not necessarily reviewed by FDA later. FDA also collects information on the use of those medications. That information is voluntarily submitted by physicians, so it's not as part of a trial. That leads to different.
I mean, I think there's also the issue and it's a question, as we advance, we learn more. And the big issue right now, of course, is personalized medicine. But a clinical study that's done is done on a cohort of patients, which is generally quite small. And it may not reflect the genetic diversity within the population at large. And in fact, that particular drug may actually act in different ways on subsets of that population. And there's definitely an ethical issue associated with that.
If I could just add one more comment here, and that is, sometimes even when you have all of the data, if you don't know how to interpret it, if you don't really understand it in great detail, even though it's right in front of your face, it's not very meaningful. And so there's a second problem that some people have with release of certain kinds of data, and that is that they worry that if you don't fully understand the science and medicine behind it, that you might misinterpret it, right? And so whether or not that's a valid issue in any particular study, it may or may not be true. But it is of concern for some people that they may misinterpret certain aspects of data that's released too soon. Let me repeat the question first. And it's a comment, actually, and the comment is basically, we all have the ability now to go in and look at this information online, try to figure out what's going on with our own health, and make our own predictions about what's needed. So when we go to the physician, instead of asking them to give us advice, we tell them what we need.
I mean, I think you've raised a very interesting point, and it sort of relates to this having the world's knowledge at your fingertips that I was trying to emphasize earlier. But so the way that we actually teach now medical students, and I teach particularly pharmacy students, is the idea that patients are going to come to them much better informed than they've ever been before, and perhaps even misinformed. And then I think one of the goals, we teach a class, for example, in pharmacy informatics, where we actually teach the pharmacy students how to discern what are the most authoritative sources of information that they should be looking at themselves, and also pointing their patients to look at for themselves. So I think it's, in the coming generations, it really creates quite a different dialogue and interrelationship between a caregiver and a patient.
Yeah, I just want to add, to answer your question more directly, it's there are more patients coming in with, with information in their hands, often which physicians don't have, and saying, here's the treatment. that's certainly happening more.
And almost all of us know a case where, because they came with that information, they got the right treatment, and they wouldn't have received that right treatment otherwise. So I'll bet almost every... How many people in this room know an example of that, where someone has gone in and said, this is what I need, and had a different treatment than would have happened otherwise? Raise your hand. Let's see. Not as many as I would have expected.
They wouldn't be here, they'd be dead.
May not be that wrong. Anyway. So the comment is, it seems like if some data must be protected, all data must be protected.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but actually I was going to pose the ultimate ethical question that I think you were trying to get at in all of this. And so I'll ask the audience, because it sort of relates to what you're asking, I think. And the question is, should we post on the internet data and information for how to make an atomic bomb? Does anybody think yes? Yeah, so maybe, it's true in some sense. So maybe, ultimately, so that's actually a good point, because however hard you try and secure something, ultimately it kind of leaks out in some, slowly but surely, in any case. And, I think that's the nature of the medium and the world that we live in now. It comes back to this point I was making. It was so easy to click a button and distribute a photograph to everyone in your family. It takes 1 second. Well, if you have a piece of information that relates to building a bomb, it only takes 1 second to post that, and then others can add to that. So it's very hard to contain things. So the question, well, it wasn't a question, it was a comment. So we now need to have a particular kind of badge that you sew on your little thing. I made an atomic bomb. Yeah.
It's got a mushroom on it. You had a second part of your question. That was a comment, not simply a question, but let me see if I can rephrase it for those who didn't hear. The issue relates to data that's not of high quality on the internet that could mislead people. But if you had the ability to actually...
Since this is an ethics forum, I want to make an important distinction about your first comment or your first question, and that is that it's a different issue to ask whether something should be done and whether it is done. The question was, should you post information on the internet about how to make an atomic bomb? That's something we could all discuss about whether we think it's right or wrong. It's a different issue to say whether it actually occurs. And to contrast this, for example, you could say, should people kill their next door neighbor? The fact that some people do kill their next door neighbor does not mean that they should kill their next door neighbors. So we want to make that distinction. It's important. It's something we can discuss perhaps at another forum. So I'll let you.
Thank you very much. So just to summarize very briefly, we now have the ability to access information very quickly from the internet. This information can be posted very quickly on the internet. Scientific data, medical data is really moving in that direction. We can't stop it. That's not something that's going to end. It's really going to happen. Much of it is clearly very good and very valuable for all of us as individual consumers in many ways. There are some ethical challenges that we face, and I think that the real issue for the future is how do we avoid releasing things that will result in harm to the public? How do we make that distinguishing decision of what gets out there and what doesn't get out there? And it's not going to be easy, but over the next few years, this is going to be a challenge that we are going to see a lot in the news because it's a big issue that's happening quickly. With that, I would like to make sure to thank the panelists. Phil Bourne, thanks for your talk. Assis Boxwala, thank you very much. And we need to thank all of the institutions and all of the people associated with the Ethics Center. Thank all of you for coming. We look forward to seeing you again next month.